The stars had never looked so beautiful through the observation deck windows of Kepler Station. Captain Jake Morrison stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the ships from a dozen different species come and go from the massive trading hub. 5 years had passed since humanity first made contact with the Galactic Council, and Jake had been there from the beginning. He remembered the excitement back on Earth when the Yolundi had detected human radio signals and sent their first diplomatic ship. Everything had changed that day in 2187 when humanity learned they were not alone in the universe. Jake turned away from the window and walked down the corridor toward the council chambers. His uniform was pressed perfectly, not a single wrinkle visible. That was important when dealing with aliens who judged you on every little detail. His crew aboard the Earth vessel Valiant had learned that lesson quickly. Be polite, be professional, and never give anyone a reason to think humans were the savage primitives some species whispered about behind closed doors. The council chambers were already filling up when Jake arrived. He spotted his diplomatic partner Claire Bennett near the entrance, her blonde hair tied back in a neat bun. She nodded at him with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. Claire had been born on Mars Colony and raised in the diplomatic corps. She knew how to read a room better than anyone Jake had ever met. Right now, her body language was telling him something was wrong. Jake moved to stand beside her and spoke quietly. Claire kept her eyes forward and whispered that Ambassador Thexilor from the Vraxian Empire had called this emergency session. The Vraxians were reptilian creatures who stood nearly 7 feet tall with scales that shimmered between green and gold depending on the light. They had controlled this entire sector of space for 300 years before humanity showed up. Thexilor was their chief representative to the council, and he had never bothered to hide his contempt for the younger species. The chamber fell silent as Thexilor entered through the main doors. His tail swished behind him as he walked, a sign that Vraxians showed when they were confident or aggressive. Jake had studied their body language extensively. Behind Thexilor came his assistants carrying data tablets and holographic projectors. This was going to be a formal presentation then, not just a simple discussion. The creche representative, matriarch Zix Andra, chittered nervously from her seat. The insectoid species had compound eyes that made it impossible to tell where they were looking, but Jake could see her antennae twitching. The creche had been the first species conquered by the Vraxians centuries ago. They were still technically independent, but everyone knew they followed Vraxian orders. The Yolundi collective shimmered in their containment sphere near the back of the room. They were gaseous beings who communicated through color changes and chemical signals translated by computers. The Yolundi had been the ones to discover humanity, and Jake had always felt they were friendly toward Earth, but they were also cautious to the point of cowardice when it came to opposing the Vraxians. Thexilor activated. The holographic display at the center of the chamber, a map of the local sector appeared, showing the territories controlled by each species. Human space was shown in blue, a small cluster of systems near the outer edge. Vraxian space was red and dominated nearly half the display. The ambassador began speaking in his hissing voice that the translation software rendered into flat, emotionless words. He spoke about the need for stability in the sector. He talked about how younger species sometimes expanded too quickly and caused problems for their neighbors. He mentioned several incidents where human mining operations had ventured too close to Vraxian borders. Jake kept his face neutral, but his jaw clenched. Those mining operations had been in unclaimed systems nowhere near Vraxian territory. This was about something else. Then Thexilor got to the point. He was proposing new regulations for the Galactic Council. Any species that had joined the Council within the last 50 years would have their expansion limited to their current systems. Their military capabilities would be restricted to defensive forces only. And most importantly, any colonies they established would require Vraxian oversight to ensure they met proper galactic standards. Claire's hand moved to the table edge and gripped it hard enough that her knuckles went white. Jake wanted to stand up and shout that this was obvious tyranny dressed up in diplomatic language. But he stayed seated and kept his expression calm. That was what Earth had sent him here to do. Be the reasonable voice. Never give them an excuse to call humans aggressive or dangerous. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes. Thexilor brought up examples of human behavior that he claimed were concerning. Human ships flew too aggressively near stations. Human traders were too competitive in the markets. Human colonies were being established too quickly without proper environmental studies. Each complaint was technically true but stripped of context. Yes, human pilots flew aggressively because they came from a world with chaotic weather patterns, where cautious flying got you killed. Yes, human traders were competitive because Earth's economy ran on free market principles. Yes, colonies were being established quickly because humanity had 11 billion people and desperately needed room to grow. None of that mattered to Thexeler. He wanted humanity boxed in and controlled. The Vraxians had ruled this sector for centuries, and they were not about to let some upstart Deathworld species challenge their authority. When the presentation ended, Claire asked to speak. She stood gracefully and addressed the council with the same calm professionalism she always showed. She acknowledged the Vraxian concerns and requested time for Earth's government to review the proposed regulations. It was a reasonable request. Basic diplomatic protocol said that major policy changes required consultation with home governments. Thexeler's tongue flicked out between his teeth. He said that the matter was too urgent to wait. The vote would be held immediately. Claire started to protest, but the Vraxian ambassador cut her off. The regulations were necessary for galactic peace and security. Any delay would be seen as human reluctance to cooperate with the established order. Jake watched as the vote was called. The Vraxians voted yes, obviously. The Kresh voted yes after only a moment's hesitation. The Yolundi shimmered through several colors before settling on a pale agreement. 3 smaller species that Jake barely knew voted with the Vraxians because they had no choice. Only one species, the distant Thelorn, who rarely attended council sessions, abstained. The measure passed. Humanity's expansion was now limited by galactic law. Their military would be restricted. Their colonies would be subject to Vraxian inspection and approval. Claire sat down heavily in her chair. Jake looked across the chamber at Thexeler and saw something that made his blood run cold. The Vraxian ambassador was not celebrating his victory. He was looking at the human delegation with pure contempt. His eyes said everything his words had carefully avoided. He thought humans were weak. He thought they were soft primitives who could be pushed around because they smiled and followed the rules. He thought humanity's politeness was fear rather than choice. That was the Vraxian Empire's first mistake. They had forgotten to ask why a species from a death world would be so eager to play nice with everyone. They had not stopped to consider what humans were capable of when they decided cooperation was no longer worth the effort. Jake stood and walked out of the chamber with Claire beside him. Neither of them spoke until they were back in the private quarters assigned to Earth's delegation. Then Claire asked what they were going to do. Jake pulled out his secure communicator and sent an encrypted message back to Earth Command. The message was simple and direct. They had tried diplomacy. They had followed every rule and bent over backward to be good galactic citizens. They had been rewarded with chains. Now it was time for Earth to make a choice. Keep playing nice and accept subjugation, or remind the galaxy why humans had survived on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill them. The emergency transmission from Kepler Station reached Earth 8 hours after the council vote. President Helen Stone sat in the Situation Room deep beneath Geneva, surrounded by holographic displays showing every human colony and outpost across known space. The message from Jake Morrison and Claire Bennett played on the main screen for the 3rd time. Helen watched the recording with her hands folded on the table in front of her. Around her sat the leaders of the unified Earth government, representatives from every continent and major colony. Nobody spoke while the message played. When it ended, the room remained silent for a long moment. Helen looked at each face around the table and saw the same expression on all of them. Anger mixed with something that had been buried for 5 years under layers of diplomatic courtesy. Admiral Frank Cooper broke the silence first. He was a tall man with gray hair and a face lined from 40 years of military service. Frank had commanded the defense of Luna Base during the water riots of 2179, and everyone respected his judgment. Frank activated his own display and brought up intelligence reports that Earth's spy network had been gathering for months. The Vraxians were planning something bigger than just council regulations. Their fleet movements showed a clear pattern of ships moving toward human space. Supply depots were being established along the border. The Vraxian Military Command had issued orders for what they called peacekeeping operations in newly restricted zones. It did not take a genius to understand what that meant. Helen asked Frank to give his assessment without softening the truth. The admiral looked directly at her and said that the Vraxians were preparing to occupy key human outposts within the next 60 days. They would claim they were enforcing the Council regulations and providing oversight. In reality, they would be taking control of human territory through military force. The other species would watch and do nothing because they were too afraid of Vraxian retaliation. Defense Minister Carlos Rivera spoke up next. He was younger than most people in the room, only 42, but he had been born on Titan and understood the colonies in a way that Earth politicians sometimes did not. Carlos said that the outer colonies were already preparing to resist. Messages were flooding in from every human settlement demanding that Earth take action. If the government did nothing, the colonies might decide to fight on their own. That would be a disaster because isolated human settlements could not stand against Vraxian warships. Helen stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Geneva looked peaceful in the early morning light. She had been elected on a platform of peaceful expansion and diplomatic integration with the galactic community. She had genuinely believed that humanity could be part of something larger than themselves. The Vraxians had made it clear that belief was naive. They saw kindness as weakness and cooperation as surrender. She turned back to the room and asked the question that everyone was thinking. What if humanity stopped being nice? The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Minister of Science Patricia Wells leaned forward in her chair. She was responsible for all of Earth's research and development programs, including the ones that did not appear in public budgets. Patricia said that humanity had capabilities the Vraxians knew nothing about. The truth was that humans had been preparing for conflict since the day they met the Galactic Council. Not because they wanted war, but because every lesson from Earth's history said that species who could not defend themselves got conquered. Hidden shipyards existed throughout the solar system. Advanced weapons research continued in classified facilities on Europa and Ceres. The human fleet was much larger than the handful of diplomatic vessels the galaxy knew about, but weapons alone would not be enough. Frank brought up tactical assessments showing that Vraxian ships were larger and more heavily armed according to galactic standards. A straight fight would be difficult. Helen asked what humans had that the Vraxians did not. Frank smiled for the first time that morning. He said that humans came from a world that had spent millions of years trying to kill them, and they were still here. Every human carried the genetic legacy of ancestors who survived plagues and ice ages and predators in each other. Humans knew how to fight because fighting was what they did best. The vote was unanimous. Earth would reject the Council regulations and prepare for war. But there would be more to it than just fighting. Helen wanted the galaxy to understand that humanity had been diplomatic by choice, not necessity. They had followed the rules because they believed in peace, not because they were weak. The Vraxians were about to learn a lesson that every bully in human history had eventually learned. Push the peaceful too far, and discover they are only peaceful because they choose to be. Orders went out immediately to every human vessel and colony. The diplomatic masks were coming off. No more careful wording or patient explanations. No more turning the other cheek when insulted. Humanity had tried to be good galactic citizens and been rewarded with chains. Now they would show the galaxy what humans looked like when they stopped pretending to be civilized. Jake Morrison received his new orders aboard the Valiant while docked at Kepler Station. He read them twice to make sure he understood correctly. Then he called his senior staff to the conference room. Pilot Lucy Grant arrived first. She was short and compact with close-cropped black hair and reflexes fast enough to make her one of the best pilots in the fleet. Engineer Peter Hayes came next, a big man with gentle hands who could fix anything mechanical. Medical Officer Karen White followed, quiet and efficient with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Security Chief Greg Palmer was last, a former Marine who had volunteered for space service because he wanted to see the stars. Jake laid out the situation without sugarcoating anything. The Vraxians were coming to occupy human colonies. Earth had decided to resist. The Valiant and 3 other ships were being sent to Prosperity, a small human colony in a disputed system. Their orders were to defend the colony by any means necessary. Rules of engagement were simple. Protect human lives and human territory. Everything else was secondary. Lucy asked if they were really going to fight Vraxian warships. Jake said yes. Greg smiled and asked when they were leaving. Peter started pulling up ship schematics and making notes about weapon modifications they could implement. Karen quietly began reviewing medical protocols for combat casualties. Nobody questioned the orders. Nobody suggested trying more diplomacy. The truth was that every member of Jake's crew had been holding back for 5 years. They had all served in Earth's military before joining the diplomatic fleet. They knew how to fight but had been ordered to smile and nod and never show teeth. That order was rescinded. Now they could be themselves again. The Valiant undocked from Kepler Station 12 hours later. 3 other Earth vessels joined them, ships that had been doing peaceful survey work in nearby systems. Their captains had received the same orders Jake had. Defend humanity, show no mercy to those who would cage them, make the galaxy remember that humans survived because they were dangerous, not lucky. As the 4 ships accelerated toward prosperity, Jake stood on the bridge and thought about what was coming. The Vraxians thought they understood humans because they had seen them being diplomatic and polite. They thought humanity's smile meant weakness. They were about to discover their mistake. Humans had evolved on a planet where nearly everything was poisonous, venomous, or carnivorous. They had survived ice ages and droughts and volcanic winters. They had climbed to the top of the food chain despite being weaker and slower than most predators. They had done it through persistence and intelligence and a fundamental refusal to accept defeat. For 5 years, humanity had been peaceful because they believed that was how civilized species behaved. But if the galaxy wanted to treat them as prey, humans remembered very well how to be predators. Their ancestors had hunted mammoths and saber-toothed cats. They had fought wars that killed millions and learned from every mistake. They had reached into space despite every setback and obstacle. The Vraxians were used to species that evolved on gentle worlds where conflict was rare and cooperation was natural. They had never fought anyone who came from a death world where survival meant constant adaptation. They were about to get an education in what that meant. Lucy checked the navigation display and reported that they would reach prosperity in 3 days. Jake acknowledged the report and gave orders for the crew to begin combat preparations. The ship's armory was opened for the first time in 5 years. Weapons that had been kept in storage were brought online. Training drills that had been neglected were resumed with intensity. The galaxy thought it knew humanity. It was about to learn how wrong it was. Humans had been playing nice because that was the right thing to do, but nobody should ever mistake restraint for inability. The Vraxians had made that mistake, and now they would pay for it in blood and broken ships. Jake looked at the stars ahead and felt something he had not felt in years. Not fear or doubt, but anticipation. Humanity was going to war, and the galaxy would never look at them the same way again. The Vraxian blockade fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Prosperity system. Exactly 3 weeks after the council vote, Commander Zethvar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and surveyed the 12 warships under his command. Each vessel was a massive display of Vraxian military power, bristling with weapons and carrying enough firepower to reduce a planet to ash. The orders from the Emperor were clear and simple. Enforce the new regulations, establish control over the human colony, and demonstrate to the galaxy that Vraxian authority would not be questioned. Zethvar had fought in 17 campaigns across his long career. He had conquered rebellious Kresh colonies and suppressed Yolundi resistance movements. Humans would be no different. They were soft creatures who talked too much and fought too little. The commander had watched recordings of human diplomats at council sessions, always apologizing and compromising. He expected this assignment to be over within a day. The tactical display showed prosperity below, a small green world with one major settlement and several mining outposts. The human colony held maybe 30,000 people and had minimal defenses. Standard procedure would be to demand surrender, occupy the key facilities, and install Vraxian oversight personnel. If the humans resisted, a few warning shots would remind them of reality. Then the sensors officer made a startled hissing sound. 4 ships had appeared on the display, emerging from behind Prosperity's larger moon. They were human vessels, but not the small colony transport Zethvar expected. These were warships, and one of them matched the profile of the Valiant, the diplomatic vessel commanded by that irritating Captain Morrison. Zethvar ordered communications to open a channel. Jake Morrison's face appeared on the main screen, but something was different. The human was not smiling. His eyes were cold and his voice had lost all the careful politeness that Vraxian intelligence files described. Jake said that the Vraxian fleet had entered human territory without permission. They had one chance to turn around and leave. If they did not, they would discover why humans evolved on a death world. The threat was so absurd that Zethvar actually laughed. He informed Morrison that the Galactic Council had granted the Vraxian Empire authority over this system. Resistance was illegal and would be met with overwhelming force. The human captain should surrender immediately to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Jake's response was 2 words. Come try, the channel closed. Zethvar felt his crest flush with anger at the disrespect. He gave orders for the fleet to advance and disable the human ships. They would teach these primitives a lesson about challenging their betters. The 12 Vraxian warships moved forward in a standard battle formation that had been perfected over centuries of conquest. What happened next would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for generations. The human ships did not retreat or attempt to negotiate further. They accelerated directly toward the Vraxian fleet at speeds that seemed reckless. Lucy Grant piloted the Valiant like it was a fighter craft rather than a warship, weaving through space in patterns that made no tactical sense according to Vraxian doctrine. The first exchange of weapons fire showed the difference immediately. Vraxian ships were designed for long-range bombardment and sustained battles. Their weapons were powerful but cycled slowly to avoid overheating. Human weapons fired in rapid bursts that seemed to ignore safety protocols. Peter Hayes had modified the Valiant's systems to prioritize damage output over equipment longevity. If the weapons burned out after the battle, they could be replaced. Winning mattered more than preservation. Zethvar ordered his ships to target the Valiant first, recognizing it as the command vessel. But Lucy was flying the ship in ways that defied every tactical prediction. She used gravity wells from nearby asteroids to slingshot around, building velocity that should have torn the ship apart. She flew into debris fields that Vraxian sensors marked as too dangerous to navigate. Human reflexes, evolved on a chaotic world with violent weather, allowed maneuvers that reptilian Vraxians simply could not match. 2 Vraxian cruisers collided while trying to track the human vessels. The massive ships were powerful but slow to maneuver. Their commanders had trained for battles against enemies who followed predictable patterns. Humans were not predictable. They fought like the predators they had evolved from, using ambush tactics and hit-and-run attacks that wore down larger opponents. Greg Palmer led a boarding team onto a Vraxian destroyer that had been damaged by weapons fire. The Vraxian crew expected negotiations or demands for surrender. Instead, they got human Marines who had trained in close combat since childhood. Humans were weaker than Vraxians in raw strength, but they had learned to fight dirty over millennia of warfare. Eye strikes, joint locks, and weapons designed to maximize pain rather than quick kills. The Vraxians were used to honorable combat between equals. Humans had given up on honor when their ancestors were fighting cave bears. The battle lasted 4 hours but felt like days to Zethvar. Every tactic he tried failed. When he used his fleet's size advantage to surround the human ships, they simply blasted through the weakest point and escaped. When he tried to match their aggressive flying, his ships could not keep up. When he fell back to defensive positions, the humans attacked relentlessly from multiple angles. Karen White worked in the medical bay, treating injuries that came from pushing the ship beyond safe limits. Broken bones from excessive G-forces, burns from overheating systems, and cuts from equipment failures. She patched them up and sent them back to their stations without hesitation. Humans had evolved to ignore pain when survival required it. Adrenaline and determination carried them through damage that would have incapacitated species from gentler worlds. The turning point came when the Eternal Dominion's shields failed under sustained fire from all 4 human ships. Zethvar had diverted power to weapons, expecting the battle to be won through superior firepower. He had not anticipated that humans would target life support systems instead of engines or weapons. Jake Morrison gave an order that made it clear humanity was done being nice. Disable their life support and let them choose between surrender and suffocation. The Vraxian crew scrambled for emergency environment suits as atmosphere vented from breached sections. Zethvar watched his tactical display fill with red warning indicators. Half his fleet was damaged or disabled. The other half was barely holding formation, and the 4 human ships showed no signs of backing down. They attacked with a ferocity that seemed insane until you remembered where they came from. Zethvar had never retreated in his entire career. Pride and duty demanded he fight to the death, but looking at those 4 ships and imagining how many more humans might be waiting behind them made something crack in his certainty. He gave the order to withdraw. The remaining Vraxian vessels that could still navigate turned and fled toward the system's edge. Behind them, the human ships did not pursue but instead held position around Prosperity, like guards who had just proven their worth. Jake stood on the bridge of the Valiant and watched the Vraxian fleet retreat. His ship was damaged. 2 crew members were seriously injured, and they had pushed every system beyond recommended limits. But they had won. More importantly, they had sent a message. Lucy asked if he thought the Vraxians got the point. Jake said it did not matter because everyone else would. The battle had been broadcast across the entire system on open frequencies. Every merchant ship, every station, every species with sensors in range had watched the fight. Within hours, the recordings were spreading across the galactic network. Species who had only known humans as polite diplomats were seeing something entirely different. On Kepler Station, the alien species gathered to watch the battle recordings in stunned silence. The Kresh matriarch's antennae trembled as she watched human ships perform maneuvers that should have been impossible. The Yolundi collective shimmered through colors that their translation computers struggled to interpret. Other species who had barely noticed humanity before suddenly started asking questions about Earth and what kind of world produced creatures like this. The recordings showed humans fighting with a combination of skill and brutality that made sense only when you understood their origin. They came from a planet that tried to kill them through disease, predators, weather, and geography. They had survived by becoming the most dangerous thing on their world. For 5 years they had hidden that nature behind diplomatic smiles because they wanted to be part of a civilized galaxy. The Vraxians had mistaken that desire for weakness. They had pushed humanity into a corner and expected submission. Instead, they discovered that cornered humans were more dangerous than any other species the galaxy had encountered. Humans did not surrender when threatened. They fought back with everything they had and refused to stop until the threat was eliminated. Jake sent a message to Earth Command reporting the victory. Then he sent another message on open galactic frequencies that anyone could intercept. The message was addressed to the Galactic Council and every species that had voted for the restrictions. Humanity had tried peace and been answered with oppression. Now they would defend themselves by any means necessary. Any species that attempted to enforce the illegal regulations would be met with the same IEI. The Vraxian Emperor received news of the defeat at Prosperity while holding court in his ancestral palace. The massive throne room fell silent as Commander Zethvar's report played for the assembled nobles and military commanders. When the recording ended, the Emperor's crest flushed deep crimson with rage. 300 years of Vraxian dominance could not be challenged by some upstart species from the galactic rim. Pride demanded a response, and political reality made that response inevitable. The Grand Fleet was assembled within 2 weeks. Over 100 warships drawn from every corner of Vraxian territory, including vessels that had been in reserve for decades. The Emperor personally appointed High Commander Vexthor to lead the armada. Vexthor was ancient even by Vraxian standards, having commanded fleets when the Kresh were first conquered. He stood before the Emperor and swore an oath to erase humanity from the galaxy if they did not submit. News of the Grand Fleet's assembly spread quickly through the galactic networks. Every species watched and waited to see how humanity would respond. The expectation was that Earth would panic and beg for negotiations. Even species sympathetic to humanity privately doubted they could stand against such overwhelming force. The Vraxians had crushed larger rebellions with smaller fleets, but Earth's response was not fear. President Helen Stone addressed all human colonies and outposts through simultaneous broadcast. She stood in front of the unified Earth government building in Geneva, with no protective barrier between herself and the cameras. Her voice was calm and clear as she spoke about the choice humanity faced. They could surrender and live under Vraxian control, or they could fight for the freedom they had earned through millions of years of survival on a death world. The vote was unanimous across every human settlement. They would fight, not because they wanted war, but because humans had learned long ago that submission to bullies only invited more abuse. Their ancestors had fought tyrants on Earth for thousands of years. They would fight tyrants among the stars just as fiercely. Hidden shipyards throughout the solar system switched to full production. Facilities on Europa and Ceres that had been building colony ships retooled to produce warships. The asteroid belt became a massive industrial complex as mining operations shifted to military production. Earth had been preparing for this possibility since first contact, not because they were warlike, but because history taught that peaceful species needed the ability to defend themselves. Commander Lisa Chen led the defense preparations at the Mars shipyards. She was younger than most fleet commanders at only 35, but she had grown up on Mars and learned to fly in the thin atmosphere where mistakes meant death. Lisa commanded a wing of fighter craft that would have been considered obsolete by galactic standards. Small single-pilot ships with limited weapons and no shields. But humans had been building fighter aircraft for over 2 centuries and had learned to make them deadly. The first Vraxian strike force arrived at Mars expecting to destroy the shipyards quickly. They found Lisa's fighter wing waiting for them. The Vraxians had never developed small craft tactics because their battles were always between large capital ships. Fighters seemed irrelevant when one missile from a cruiser could destroy a dozen of them, but that logic assumed the fighters would stay still long enough to be targeted. Lisa led her pilots in a dance through the Vraxian formation that seemed suicidal until you understood the math. Human reflexes were faster than Vraxian targeting computers. Fighter craft could change direction quicker than capital ship weapons could track. And most importantly, humans had spent centuries developing aerial combat tactics on a world where the atmosphere tried to kill you every time you flew. The fighters swarmed over the Vraxian ships like insects, too small and fast to hit reliably, but each carrying weapons that could damage vital systems. They targeted sensor arrays and communication equipment and weapon mounts. Death by 1,000 cuts was a human strategy that dated back to ancient warfare. The Vraxians had never encountered anything like it. 3 Vraxian ships were disabled before the strike force commander ordered a retreat. Lisa's wing had lost 8 fighters out of 40, a horrific casualty rate by peacetime standards. But this was not peacetime, and the pilots who died had bought time for the shipyards to complete their production runs. More importantly, they had proven that human tactics could defeat Vraxian power through speed and aggression. The Grand Fleet's advance toward human space slowed as reports of these defeats reached High Commander Vexthor. He began to understand that the battle at Prosperity had not been luck or surprise. Humans fought differently than any species the Vraxians had encountered. They used kamikaze tactics that risked their own lives to damage enemies. They targeted systems that caused maximum disruption rather than maximum destruction. They fought like they had nothing to lose because their entire history was one of survival against impossible odds. But pride would not let Vexthor turn back. The Grand Fleet continued forward, moving more cautiously now but still confident that sheer numbers would prevail. 100 warships against perhaps 20 human vessels. The math seemed simple, even accounting for human tactical advantages. What Vexthor did not know was that humans had been sending messages to other species while the Grand Fleet assembled. Not threats, but offers. The Vraxians had ruled through fear for 3 centuries, crushing any species that showed independence. Humanity offered something different: alliance against tyranny, freedom to develop without Vraxian oversight, and most importantly, proof that the Vraxians could be beaten. The Kresh were the first to respond. Matriarch Zixandra sent a secret delegation to Earth carrying data about Vraxian fleet movements and supply lines. The Kresh had suffered under Vraxian control for generations and wanted revenge. But they were not warriors by nature and needed help. Humanity offered that help in exchange for Kresh industrial support. The alliance was formed in secret and announced only when Kresh ships began attacking Vraxian supply convoys. The Yolundi Collective followed within days. They were still cautious, but the battle recordings had convinced them that humanity might actually win. More importantly, humans had reached out as equals rather than conquerors. The Yolundi joined the alliance and provided their advanced sensor technology. Suddenly, human ships could detect Vraxian vessels before the Vraxians could detect them. Other species began making quiet contact with Earth. The Thelorn, who had abstained from the council vote. The Mordian, who had been conquered by the Vraxians 50 years ago and still resented it. Even some Vraxian colony governors who were tired of the Emperor's endless wars. The Grand Fleet found itself fighting not 1 species but 5. And the humans were teaching their allies tactics that the Vraxians had no defense against. Greg Palmer trained mixed species, boarding teams on techniques humans had developed over thousands of years of close combat. The Kresh learned how to use their natural climbing abilities for ambush attacks. The Yolundi discovered they could disable life support systems more effectively than any weapon. Each species brought their own strengths, and humans showed them how to maximize those advantages. High Commander Vexthor watched his tactical displays fill with enemy contacts that should not exist. The Grand Fleet was being harassed from multiple directions by forces that coordinated their attacks with precision. Supply lines were cut, communications were jammed. Individual ships were isolated and overwhelmed before reinforcements could arrive. These were human tactics being executed by a coalition that grew larger every day. The battle for the Kepler system became the turning point. Vexthor brought 60 ships to capture the neutral trading hub and cut off human access to galactic markets. He found 30 vessels waiting for him, a mix of human, Kresh, Yolundi, and Thelorn craft. The battle lasted 3 days and ended with the Grand Fleet retreating in disorder. Vexthor had lost 20 ships and gained nothing. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant during that battle and realized something fundamental had changed. This was no longer about humanity defending itself. This had become a revolution against the entire system of Vraxian dominance. Every species that had been bullied or conquered or intimidated was watching and seeing that resistance was possible. The alliance was growing faster than anyone had predicted. Peter Hayes worked around the clock to share human engineering techniques with Kresh technicians. Karen White trained Yolundi medical personnel in human emergency procedures. Lucy Grant taught pilots from 4 different species how to fly aggressively rather than cautiously. Humans were not just fighting the Vraxians, they were transforming the entire galactic approach to warfare. The concept of total war was alien to species that evolved on peaceful worlds. Most galactic conflicts were limited affairs with rules about acceptable targets and proper conduct. Humans came from a world where survival meant using every advantage and exploiting every weakness. They taught their allies that war was not a game with rules but a struggle for existence where only victory mattered. The Grand Fleet fragmented as it tried to respond to threats from multiple directions. Vexthor could not be everywhere at once, and his subordinate commanders were trained for conventional warfare against single opponents. They did not know how to handle coordinated attacks from Mu. The peace treaty was transmitted across every galactic frequency at dawn on Earth, and at whatever time corresponded to dawn on 1,000 other worlds. President Helen Stone stood in the rebuilt council chambers on Kepler Station, surrounded by representatives from 17 species. The Vraxian delegation sat quietly in chairs that seemed too small for their large frames. Ambassador Thexler was not among them. He had been recalled to the homeworld in disgrace, and his replacement was a younger Vraxian named Kexizal, who had the sense to look humble. The treaty was simple in its core provisions. All restrictions on human expansion were void and declared illegal from their inception. The Galactic Council would be dissolved and reformed with equal representation for every species, regardless of size or military power. Any species that attempted to subjugate another through force or coercion would face unified opposition from all council members. The Age of Empire was officially over, but Helen had insisted on one additional provision that caused considerable debate. The treaty included a formal warning that would be encoded in every galactic database and taught in every school across known space. Humans were a Deathworld species who had chosen diplomacy because they believed in peace, not because they lacked the capacity for violence. Their restraint should never be mistaken for weakness. Any species that failed to understand this distinction would learn it through harsh experience. Jake Morrison watched the signing ceremony from the observation deck where he had stood 5 years ago, contemplating the beauty of the stars. So much had changed since then. The Valiant bore scars from a dozen battles. Half his original crew had been transferred to other ships or promoted to command positions. Lucy Grant now captained her own vessel. Greg Palmer trained security forces across 3 systems. Peter Hayes led the engineering teams designing the next generation of human warships. Karen White directed the medical academy on Mars, where humans taught alien doctors techniques for treating combat injuries. Claire Bennett stood beside Jake at the window. She had been promoted to Earth's chief diplomatic representative and spent most of her time negotiating trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. She commented that it was strange how things had worked out. They had tried so hard to be good diplomats and been punished for it. Then they became warriors and earned more respect than diplomacy ever achieved. Jake said that respect built on fear was temporary, but respect built on demonstrated capability lasted. The galaxy had learned that humans could be dangerous when necessary. Now they were learning that humans could also be generous allies and fair partners. The combination made humanity more influential than military power alone ever could. The Kresh had benefited enormously from the alliance. With Vraxian oversight removed, their industrial facilities were producing goods for free trade rather than tribute. Matriarch Zixandra visited Earth twice and marveled at how humans had survived on such a violent world. She told Helen that the Kresh had evolved on a planet where everything cooperated naturally. They had no concept of predators or competition until they met the Vraxians. Humans had taught them that cooperation could be a choice rather than an instinct, which made it more valuable. The Yolundi Collective established a permanent presence in Earth's orbital stations. They were fascinated by human culture and spent countless hours trying to understand how creatures so prone to violence could also create such beautiful art and music.
One Yolundi philosopher wrote that humans contained multitudes, capable of both extreme cruelty and extreme kindness depending on circumstances.
That duality made them unpredictable but also interesting. The Vraxian Empire did not collapse, but it changed fundamentally. The Emperor died 6 months after the treaty was signed, some said from shame. His successor was a reformer who accepted the new reality. Vraxian colonies that had been held through fear were granted independence. The military was downsized and repurposed for defense rather than conquest. It would take generations for the Vraxians to fully adapt, but the process had begun. Jake received orders to return to Earth after 18 months of continuous deployment. The journey home gave him time to reflect on everything that had happened. They had gone to war not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was subjugation. They had won not because they were stronger, but because they refused to accept defeat. And they had changed the galaxy not by imposing their will, but by offering an alternative to tyranny. Earth looked different when the Valiant entered orbit. More ships filled the space lanes, representing dozens of species who came to trade or study or simply experience the legendary death world that had produced such formidable creatures. Luna Base had expanded to 3 times its original size. Mars colonies were flourishing with populations that included non-humans who wanted to live among the species that had freed them from fear. President Helen Stone met Jake in person at the Geneva spaceport. She thanked him for his service and asked what he planned to do next. Jake said he wanted to return to Kepler Station. The war was over, but peace required constant maintenance. Someone needed to make sure the new council functioned properly, and that disputes were resolved before they became conflicts. Helen smiled and said that sounded exactly like something a diplomat would say. The reformation of the Galactic Council took another year of negotiations. The new structure gave each species voting power proportional to their population, but required supermajorities for any action that affected sovereignty or territory. Humans insisted on including species that had been too small or weak to have representation before. The Mordian and Thelorn and a dozen others joined the council with full rights. Jake returned to Kepler Station as Earth's chief representative. The station had been rebuilt after suffering damage during the war. The new design incorporated elements from multiple species, a physical symbol of cooperation replacing dominance. Claire remained on Earth but visited regularly to consult on major decisions. The observation deck where Jake had first learned of the Vraxian restrictions became his favorite place to think. He stood there one evening watching ships from 20 species moving through the traffic lanes in an organized dance. Lucy Grant docked her ship and came to find him. She had just returned from exploring an unclaimed system on the galactic rim and brought survey data showing 3 potentially habitable worlds. They talked about the old days when humans had been so careful to smile and compromise. Lucy said she did not miss that version of humanity. Jake agreed but added that the diplomatic mask had served a purpose. It had bought time for humanity to understand the galaxy before revealing their true nature. Now the galaxy understood both sides of humanity and could make informed choices about how to interact with them. The treaty's warning about Death World species had become famous across known space. Children learned about Earth's hostile environment and how it had shaped human evolution. Scientists studied human biology to understand how such fragile creatures could be so resilient. Military academies analyzed human tactics and tried to adapt them for their own forces with limited success because aggression did not come naturally to species from peaceful worlds. Greg Palmer visited Kepler Station, leading a delegation of security officers from 6 species. They were implementing new protocols for protecting commercial vessels from pirates. The pirates had flourished under Vraxian rule because the Empire only cared about threats to its own interests. Now the Alliance was systematically hunting them down using human tracking techniques and Yolundi sensor technology. Crime was becoming a poor career choice in the New Order. Karen White published a medical journal detailing treatment protocols developed during the war. Her work on multi-species trauma care had saved thousands of lives and established standards that would be used for generations. She received honors from 3 different species and declined them all, saying she had just done her job. That attitude was typically human, according to alien observers who were used to leaders demanding recognition for every achievement. Peter Hayes was designing civilian ships that incorporated lessons learned from warship construction, faster engines, more efficient life support, and safety features that assumed things would go wrong rather than hoping they would not. Human engineering philosophy assumed failure and planned accordingly, which made their designs more reliable than traditional galactic approaches that assumed everything would work perfectly. The new normal felt strange to everyone who remembered the old ways. Species that had feared each other for centuries were now working together on joint projects. Trade flourished without Vraxian tariffs and tribute. Science advanced through shared research rather than isolated development. The galaxy was genuinely peaceful for the first time in living memory, but the peace was not based on naivety or wishful thinking. Every species understood that human warships remained on patrol throughout the sector. The Alliance maintained a ready military force capable of responding to any threat within hours. Humans had taught the galaxy that peace required strength and the willingness to use that strength when necessary. Jake received a message from Admiral Frank Cooper asking if he was happy with his decision to return to diplomacy. Jake responded that he had never left diplomacy. The war had been diplomacy by other means, teaching lessons that W.